Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us for the fourth in this semester's series of TGI FHI, the Franklin Humanities Institute's Friday morning series. TGI FHI gives Duke faculty in the humanities, interpretive social sciences, and the arts the opportunity to present on their current research to interlocutors in their fields and in related fields, and allows you, the audience, to get to know our faculty in these areas at Duke University. There is no agenda or theme indicated in the series, no demand to be disciplinary or interdisciplinary, although today we have a very interdisciplinary speaker, just to present the work that faculty are doing that most excites them at this time. And while I regret that we cannot meet over breakfast this morning in Smith Warehouse at Duke, our usual location for TGI FHI, I am delighted that we're able to include in this format colleagues and interested publics from near and far. And I can see already we have over 80 people here, some very local and some from much further away. On the website of the Franklin Humanities Institute, you can find recordings of past TGI FHIs and also an interview with Jarvis McInnis in which he describes his work. This morning, I'm very pleased to introduce Jarvis, who is Cordelia and William Laverick Family Assistant Professor of English at Duke. Before arriving at Duke in 2017, he taught for a year at Notre Dame and was also, prior to that, postdoctoral research associate in the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. He received his BA from Tougaloo College in Jackson, Mississippi, before being awarded his MA, MPhil, and PhD from Columbia. Jarvis's scholarship lies at the intersection of African American studies and diaspora studies, and unlike most scholars whose research focuses on this intersection, Jarvis does not focus on urban centers populated by cosmopolitan figures moving back and forth largely across the North Atlantic. Rather, he centers on the rural and in particular on the afterlife of the plantation. His book project focuses on cultural production from the US South, the Caribbean, and Central American locations. And while thinking of these regions together involves an analysis of slavery's history through comparative colonialisms, Jarvis in particular contributes to plantation studies that has been, largely dominated by Francophone and Hispanophone literature by bringing US Southern literature into play. His ability to understand South-South relations and a geography that brings the hemispheric circulation of ideas, peoples, texts, and commodities between the US, South, Caribbean, and Panama is impressive. He gives grit to hemispheric studies through deep archival work, for example, his work into the Garvey papers, bringing it into conversation with scholarship on the afterlife of the plantation. I should add also that unlike, not completely unlike, but unlike some of the work in that area, while paying attention to the horrifying legacy of slavery, he also shows that the plantation has been a site of resistance, of remembrance, and of alternative ways of imagining Blackness. That is what resides in the interstices of the archive and in the forms of cultural production he analyzes. Literature, to be sure, but also photography, journalism, anthropology, music. In other words, ways of imagining the possibilities of life. So, for example, in his reading of Du Bois's first novel, The Quest of the Silver Fleece from 1911, he moves respectfully beyond the focus on questions of genre, the interplay of romance, realism, and naturalism, and more recently, the influence of Du Bois's early sociological studies and his burgeoning socialism, to consider this, quote, anti-plantation romance, to extract cotton and the black, showing how that novel explains how to extract cotton, how to extract cotton and black female body from the entanglements of the plantation's political and libidinal economies, to imagine a new socioeconomic order for Southern African Americans, a cotton future that undercuts the violent and exploitative logics undergirding plantation modernity, end quote. He asks how reading the novel alongside Du Bois's later essay, The Cotton Slave from 1946, how that allows us to understand the relationship between literature, e.g. i.e. the anti-plantation romance, and the history of American capitalism in Du Bois's writings. While I've introduced Jarvis through his essay on Du Bois, I should add importantly that his work in many ways decenters Du Bois through a rethinking of Booker T. Washington's significance to the Black literary canon. McInnis's work prompts us to interrogate how Du Bois relied on the language of progress and civilization, and how the North-South binary played into the logic of that civilization. And he directs attention to how the afterlife of the plantation operates through Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee paradigm. Jarvis recently received a year-long research fellowship at the Schoenberg Center, the premier library for African and African diaspora studies. His article, A Corporate Plantation, Reading Public, Labor, Literacy, and Diaspora in the Global Black South from American Literature, was recognized with the National Cross-Disciplinary Research Society for American Periodicals 2018 to 2019 Article Prize. He's published in many prominent journals that focus variously on the international, the national, and also the regional, which is very much the point, of course. Today, he's going to talk to us about his work on Tuskegee. His talk is titled Tuskegee and the Plantationocene Toward a Theory of Eco-Ontology in Black Studies. Thanks very much for joining us, everyone. And now I'm going to hand over to Jarvis.
Thank you so much, Ranji, for that very thorough and very kind introduction. It's always thrilling to and humbling, actually, to hear colleagues talk about to talk about your work. So I really appreciate your thorough engagement with it, and I actually learned some things about my work that I didn't know. So thank you so much, and thank you so much to the Franklin Humanities Institute for the invitation to present my work today, also to the English department and the Department of African and African American Studies at Duke for helping to support this event. I had an opportunity briefly to look at the list of participants, and I saw so many colleagues across Duke, but also across universities across the country, family back in Mississippi, folks that I went to undergraduate with, and so folks in gender and sexuality studies here at Duke, English department, my home department, AAAS, biology, and so forth and so on, in the Office of Faculty Development. So I'm just thrilled that you're here to listen to me share a portion of my work with you today. And I will go ahead and get started, and just share my screen. I was talking to Elizabeth, to Sarah. I saw Elizabeth Alt from Duke Press. That's why that name stuck in my mind. But I was talking to Sarah earlier about what's so wonderful about this is that we can share our work with folks near and far. And what I love about this is that my parents are able to attend my talk. So, hey, Mom and Dad. Tuskegee and the Plantationocene Toward a Theory of Eco-Ontology in Black Studies. In my forthcoming book project, Afterlives of the Plantation, I examined Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute as a nodal point of diasporic connection and a heuristic for exploring how Afro-descended peoples responded to the legacies of the plantation in the global Black South. The global Black South is a hemispheric geography connecting the US South and the Caribbean, where the plantation was once and often continues to be the organizing principle of Black life. In so doing, I take seriously the paradox of the plantation as a space where the most extreme forms of violence were cultivated and refined against Black bodies, and yet was also the genesis of Black modernity. Ultimately, I'm interested in what else the plantation produced beyond the racial, economic, and ecological violences it set in motion and that continue to linger into the present. What Catherine McKittrick might call plantation futures, and how Black people variously adapted and jettisoned its logics of domination over people, plants, animals, and things. As a former cotton plantation turned industrial school, Tuskegee is a byproduct of the Plantationocene. The Plantationocene offers a corrective to the Anthropocene by emphasizing the plantation as a technology of global capitalist modernity, namely the co-constitutive processes and forces of racial slavery, settler colonialism, and ecological devastation. As several scholars in Black studies have reminded us, however, the Plantationocene in its original conceptualization is a fraught and contested concept. In a wonderful essay by Janae Davis, Alex Moulton, Levi Van Sant, and Brian Williams, for instance, they critique the concept for offering a flattened multi-species argument that fails to acknowledge the centrality of racialization within the plantation ecology of terror. They rightly remind us that not all humans are equally complicit in the devastation that the plantation has wrought, that we do not all share equal access to the category of man that it helped to construct, nor do we all wish to. And some of us remain the disproportionate victims of its racial capitalist offspring, from prisons to labor migration to Louisiana's Cancer Alley, for instance, as Rebecca Evans argues in her work on the Plantationocene. Furthermore, they contend that the emerging Plantationocene discussion has yet to meaningfully engage with the wide variety of existing critiques of the plantation mode of development, particularly in the fields of Black geographies and Black ecologies. And this is where I wish to enter. My own work on the afterlife of the plantation in the global Black South has focused on the myriad aesthetic practices and political economic projects that emerged in response to the plantation's legacies throughout the Western Hemisphere. From the establishment of schools like Tuskegee to Marcus Garvey's development of a steamship line to transport agricultural commodities across the Black world. In short, I have been and remain interested in the practices of diasporic relationality and articulations of Black futures within and against sites and spaces of social death. Despite the Plantationocene's initial conceptual limitations, what I find useful and thus wish to hold on to is its focus on ecology and environmentalism. Thus, examining Tuskegee, which imagined Black modernity through agriculture and farming in the immediate aftermath of slavery as a byproduct of the Plantationocene, enables me to broaden my initial aesthetic and political economic approach to the afterlife of the plantation to include the intersections of Black life and plant life as well. And that's in line with the important work of scholars like James Rohn and Justin Hosby, who are architects of the field of Black ecologies, of the subfield Black ecologies, as well as the work of scholars such as Monique Alawart and Sonia Paz-Mintier, who also work on plantation ecologies in African diaspora literature. My approach to the Plantationocene acknowledges that the plantation is a technology of racialization, economic exploitation, and resource extraction, depletion, and of course, death. However, I am also interested in logics and practices of reuse, of regeneration, sustainability, and mutuality between Black people and the earth. As a former cotton plantation turned industrial school, Tuskegee is a paradigmatic afterlife of the plantation. In his autobiography, Up from Slavery, Washington describes the school's founding thusly: About 3 months after the opening of the school, there came into the market for sale an old and abandoned plantation, which was situated about a mile from the town of Tuskegee. The mansion house, or big house as it would have been called, which had been occupied by the owners during slavery, had been burned. After making a careful examination of this place, it seemed to be just the location that we wanted in order to make our work effective and permanent, end quote. I'm interested here in what happens when Black life persists among the ashes and rubble of the burned big house, the seat of plantation governmentality, a space that rendered it fungible, expendable, and socially dead by simultaneously extracting its labor power and denying its subjectivity. Or as Anna Singh might phrase it, what does it mean to cultivate Black life amidst the ruins created by capitalism? While Singh turns to the plant world, the Matsuzaki mushroom to be exact, to explore this question, I'm interested in Black people in the afterlife of the plantation. In particular, I ask, how have Black people attempted to repurpose these spaces and logics to build, construct, and create anew? And what are the limits and possibilities of such a project? What can grow on the site of such unspeakable violence beyond cotton, sugar, rice, tobacco, and other cash crops whose cultivation was used to deplete land and Black bodies alike? What kinds of freedom dreams or blues epistemologies can such a wholly contaminated space generate? Can the originary violences ever be sufficiently burned away, evacuated, so as not to seep into the Black futures constructed on top of it? Or will the space always bear traces of its former purpose? To begin answering these queries, I turn first to Tuskegee's visual archive to demonstrate how Booker T. Washington used photographs to visualize his efforts to rehabilitate Black ontology. Although scholars typically emphasize the limits of Washington's educational and political philosophies, I argued that Tuskegee's vast visual and sonic archives elucidate how Washington theorized his own criteria for Black art, thereby resituating him, Tuskegee, and the Black US South at the helm of the new Negro movement and debates about Black political and aesthetic self-fashioning at the turn of the 20th century. Like the plantation, Tuskegee was a subject-making institution. Instead of producing commodities for the market, however, it cultivated or trained new Negroes. We're going to hold on to that notion of training. I'll come back to that. Washington had to not only transform a former plantation into a school, but also had to translate the disciplinary and colonial logics of industrial education into a mode of training that affirmed Black humanity and prepared students for the new demands of freedom and quasi-citizenship. Secondly, I shift my focus from the burned big house to the cotton fields surrounding it to consider the material, terrestrial, and broader ecological arms of Washington's and Tuskegee's aesthetic cum ontological project. In so doing, I turn to the work of renowned agricultural scientist and Tuskegee faculty member, George Washington Carver, to develop a concept I'm calling eco-ontology. As director of Tuskegee's agricultural department, Carver deployed agricultural science to make Tuskegee's worn out lands productive again after decades of degradation by abusive cotton cultivation. I'm interested in this logic of regenerating that which is depleted into something that is productive again, as a way of thinking at the intersection of land and bodies. How did some of the very people most devastated by the Plantationocene, whose coerced labor ironically contributed to the region's ecological degradation, how did they imagine the regeneration of plantation lands alongside their own transformation from enslaved property to quasi-citizens and self-determined subjects in the New South? Visualizing progress, labor, agriculture, and domesticity. In his infamous Atlanta Exposition address, Booker T. Washington declares that, quote, "No race can prosper till it learns that there is as much dignity in tilling a field as in writing a poem." I want to linger in the space between the field and the poem to take seriously Washington's equation of agriculture and poetry, labor and aesthetics. By turning to his photographic archive, I explore the ways in which he used visual culture to articulate a quotidian theory of beauty and progress. Through the convergence of agricultural and industrial labor and bourgeois domestic values, he mobilized the photograph's evidentiary capacity to depict the Southern New Negro as the exemplar of Black progress and futurity at the turn of the 20th century. Following the Civil War, newly emancipated African Americans were immediately confronted with the problem of free labor. On the one hand, Black leaders such as Frederick Douglass in Washington viewed labor as a strategy for building wealth, accruing property, and training African Americans for citizenship. Yet labor was also conceived as a mode of discipline and social control through sharecropping, the crop lien system, debt peonage, Black codes, and a host of other legal and extra-legal technologies of power that restricted Black bodies and controlled their labor. Thus, Washington was faced with the immense challenge of resignifying labor for a newly emancipated population that was circumscribed by the legacy of slavery as an institution of coerced and exploitative labor on the one hand, and the new forms of bondage and unfreedom that plagued what Saidiya Hartman calls the non-event of emancipation on the other. As he observes in his 1904 racetrack Working with the Hands, as a slave, the Negro was worked. As a freeman, he must learn to work. There's a vast difference between working and being worked. Being worked means degradation. Working means civilization, end quote. By turning to visual culture, Washington attempts to intervene in and reconstruct one of the fundamental predicaments of New World Blackness, that is the problem of labor and freedom. According to Henry Louis Gates Jr., the New Negro movement was essentially a battle over racial representation, where African-American artists and intellectuals used visual culture to challenge anti-Black propaganda circulating in mainstream media. In response to the proliferation of racist caricatures in white newspapers that represented Blackness as an index of laziness and idleness, Washington deployed photographs to depict the beauty and dignity of the laboring Black body. The images that illustrate his books and magazine articles depict the New Negro as the simple farmer, cloaked in Victorian sartorial flair, the skilled tradesman, or the autonomous industrial worker operating modern machinery. As such, Washington produced what I have termed an aesthetics of work that sought to re-signify the fraught relationship between Blackness and labor. Machinery and industrial technology were especially integral to Washington's effort to aestheticize and re-signify work as beautiful, pleasurable, and self-proprietorial. In 1902, he commissioned Frances Benjamin Johnston, one of the leading turn-of-the-century photographers, to photograph Tuskegee campus life. Her images were used for exhibitions and to illustrate numerous of his early 20th century publications. On the one hand, they might be read as highly reminiscent of the biopolitical and disciplinary regime of plantation slavery, for they literally capture the Black body yoked to and engaged in physical labor. Yet, whereas slavery exploited the Black body, Johnson portrays Tuskegee students working with steam engines, sewing machines, printing presses, and scientific instruments to demonstrate not only their willingness to work, but their mastery of science and industrial technology as well. Although Washington was not behind the camera, he still played an important role in determining which photographs were published in his books and articles. He was constantly being sent requests for cuts or photographs from publishers, as well as advice on the layout of the articles. For instance, when his publishers requested, quote, about a dozen additional cuts for a subscription edition of Working with the Hands, Washington instructed his assistant, Emmett J. Scott, to, quote, take the matter up with a good deal of care and see that the cuts are selected that will illustrate in a better manner the higher forms of work being done at Tuskegee. In the other illustrations in the first edition, he writes, the academic work, electrical engineering, architectural drawing, etc., are very largely omitted. Some of the images, end quote, Some of the images inserted in the new edition depict a chemical laboratory and classes in outdoor geometry, physiology, outdoor nature study, language, and outdoor arithmetic. Washington's insistence on depicting the higher forms of work being done at Tuskegee was clearly a response to growing criticism from the likes of W.E.B. Du Bois and other detractors regarding the limits of agricultural and industrial education for African Americans. In his extended preface to the subscription edition of Working with the Hands, then, Washington insists that the value of labor with the hands is just as important for the farmer, craftsman, or domestic as it is for those whose occupations are more in the direction of mental work alone. He emphasizes that industrial work and academic training are mutually constitutive at Tuskegee, and that their policy was to make industry pay its way if possible, but at the same time to sacrifice the training, but at the same time not to sacrifice the training to mere economic gain, right? And so this is him sort of speaking back to Du Bois's critique that he was only interested in materialism, right? The gospel of wealth. By instructing Scott, his assistant, to include images of students engaged in what he calls higher forms of education, then Washington seeks to instrumentalize the photograph as a mode of evidence to contradict his critics. The layout of Washington's periodical publications further demonstrate how he used photographs to visualize Black modernity, progress, and futurity as he conceived at Tuskegee. In his 1906 essay, 25 Years of Tuskegee, he juxtaposes images of the old Negro against the Tuskegee-trained new Negro. In one pairing, an image of an unskilled laborer, right, is contrasted with that of a skilled student in the Tuskegee shoe shop. As you see here, pictured from left to right, they are presented in the before and after format in the article. The image of the unskilled laborer is that of a scraggly and unshaven middle-aged man wearing a ragged shirt with holes in the sleeve and what appears to be a makeshift hat, perhaps to protect his head from the brutal Alabama sun. On the opposite page, a Tuskegee student is pictured operating a machine in the school shoe shop. He is young, clean-shaven, and sports a newsboy cap and work apron to protect his crisp white shirt, though it appears to be slightly soiled from working in the shop. Unlike the unskilled laborer who looks directly into the camera, the student is too preoccupied with work to notice the photographer's presence. Rather, his gaze is fixed on the machine. The captions accompanying the images are particularly revealing about how Washington utilized photography to visualize Black progress. Whereas the unskilled laborer is purportedly, quote, as shiftless and improvident as he is good-natured, his physical and mental powers wasted for lack of training, right? The caption accompanying the image of the skilled student worker enthusiastically proclaims that, quote, thorough training will make him a valuable and productive member of the community. Through the process of juxtaposing old and new forms of labor, then, Washington visualizes the Southern Black peasant's transition from slave to free laborer, sharecropper to artisan, old Negro to new Negro. Although Southern historian C. Van Woodward has famously lampooned Washington for insisting on outmoded forms of labor while the South was rapidly industrializing, these images actually depict Tuskegee students' technical proficiency with machines and other higher forms of work, and thus their preparedness for a rapidly mechanizing Southern industrial landscape. Cultivating the New Negro Woman, Gender and Domesticity at Tuskegee. Tuskegee's women's curriculum illuminates the gender dimensions of the school's aesthetic project through the convergence of beauty, agriculture, and domesticity. Led by Washington's wife, Margaret, who incidentally insisted on being called Mrs. Booker T. Washington, the women's department largely consisted of traditional domestic trades such as millinery, dressmaking, laundering, sewing, and housekeeping. In an 1895 address entitled The New Negro Woman, delivered before the Conference of Colored Women, Mrs. Washington insists that, quote, the two words, home and woman, are so closely connected that I could not, even if I wanted to, separate one from the other, end quote. Thus, Tuskegee's women's curriculum proffered a vision of new Negro womanhood that was synonymous with home and hearth, reflecting the cult of domesticity that shaped Victorian gender norms. Yet the Washingtons also revised these bourgeois ideals by introducing out-of-door industries into the women's curriculum. All through the period of slavery, Washington writes, the idea prevailed that women, not slaves, should do as little work as possible with their hands. When the colored girl became free, she naturally craved the same education in which she had seen the white woman specializing, end quote. Tuskegee's women students, many of whom were either one generation removed from slavery or had been slaves themselves, equated manual work with the ungendering of the Black female body during slavery. As Mrs. Washington observes, quote, in the awful days gone by, the word home, the word woman was a mockery so far as we are concerned. In fact, there was no home, there was no manhood. All were chattel, bought, used, and sold at the master's will. Thus, Mrs. Washington portends Horton Spillers' claim that under these conditions of psychosomatic trauma, we lose at least gender difference, and the female body and the male body become a territory of cultural and political maneuver, not at all gender related, gender specific, end quote. Initially, Tuskegee's women were very timid and felt ashamed to have anyone see them at work in the garden or orchard, Washington writes, because such out-of-door activities smacked of the violent ungendering and objectification of the Black female body that their foremothers endured during slavery. Whereas by the 1980s, Spillers and other Black feminists sought to embrace the Black woman's unique positionality out of the traditional symbolics of female gender by gaining the insurgent ground as female social subject. At the turn of the 20th century, new Negro womanhood was largely conceived in heteronormative terms that sought to regender the Black female body in accordance with the gender norms of the era and reestablish the family unit. Still, by creating outdoor industries for women and somewhat revising the very grounds upon which Black femininity was constructed, Tuskegee was somewhat ahead of its time because before women could fight to work outside of the home, they first had to be persuaded to work outdoors. Images of the women's outdoor industries underscore the gender dimensions of Washington's aesthetics of work. In the first image, none of the women look directly into the camera, for they are too absorbed in their work to notice the photographer's presence. While images of Black women working in fields bear striking resemblance to images of slavery, a closer look at the Tuskegee women's attire suggests otherwise. Though pictured in the garden with hoes in hand amid rows of dirt and crops, their clothing is more appropriate for indoor work. In this image, they each wear white or light colored blouses without a trace of dirt on them anywhere. In another image, a woman sports a dress adorned with lace instead of the headscarf that enslaved women often wore to protect their hair from dirt in the harsh southern sun. These women wear hats or simply pin their hair back neatly and away from their faces. These images of the agricultural worker cloaked in middle-class attire elucidate the paradox of Washington's Southern New Negro aesthetic as both fact and fiction, evidence and performance, artifice disguised as truth. Furthermore, in lieu of the primacy often placed on physical migration to the urban and global norths, they depict rootedness or staying put as essential to cultivating Black social mobility and the production of Black bourgeois subjectivity in the rural South. I want to return briefly to Washington's distinction between working as civilization and being worked as degradation. Despite the ways that images of the laboring Black body in this era often index slavery and coercion, I propose that alongside an aesthetics of work, Tuskegeeites were also invested in distinguishing between training and discipline, where discipline is associated with being worked and thus the exploitation of slavery, the plantation in their afterlives, while training connotes the cultivation of Southern New Negro identity. After all, the caption accompanying the image of the student operating the steam engine states, "Thorough training will make him a valuable and productive member of the community." Perhaps then, training is a useful interpretive logic for analyzing how Tuskegee's visual archive depicts the regeneration of Black life on the ruins and rubble of the burned plantation in the global Black South. Furthermore, Washington's efforts to train Tuskegee students, or the idea that the school was a training ground for the burdened individuality of freedom, was inextricably linked to coterminous efforts to retrain the ground, right, and to make it productive again, as they repurposed the physical material space of an eroded cotton plantation into an industrial school. So part 2, regenerating the plantation, Black eco-ontology. Tuskegee is located in the hilly regions of Macon County, Alabama, adjacent to, but not technically a part of, the 10 counties that make up Alabama's traditional Black Belt. The Black Belt, which spans from eastern South Central Alabama into northwestern Mississippi, originally got its name from the region's rich, dark soil, which is why it became the locus of the South's Cotton Kingdom in the 19th century. In his work on historically Black college and university campuses, Ian Grandison, a landscape architect, observes that though Tuskegee was technically located in the hills up high, the land itself was quite poor and is thus regarded as the bottoms. As a geological designation, bottomland refers to the very fertile land that's often located alongside a river. Over time, however, and particularly in African-American vernacular, it took on a socioeconomic designation as well, where bottom signaled both the poor quality of the land and Black people's social marginalization at the bottom of society. According to Grandison, Tuskegee's land is so poor because Alabama's heavy rainfall does not easily penetrate the clay-rich soils that predominate in counties such as Macon. When clay-rich soils become saturated with water, they swell, and so tend to prevent additional water from passing through them. This excess water flows over the surface as it makes its way to rivers, wetlands, and lakes. As it flows, it erodes the surface, taking valuable topsoil from uplands and depositing it in low-lying bottoms. And again, those low-lying bottoms are referring to the geological designation. Thus, Tuskegee soils were not only inherently poor for cotton cultivation by Black Belt standards, but were also severely eroded. However, Washington and other founders of early Black educational institutions were strategic in selecting these waste places, lands that had been abandoned by whites and were geographically distant from town. As a waste place, and this is what Washington called it, this was land that white people no longer wanted because the soils were inherently inferior and had been depleted by years of abusive cotton cultivation during slavery, and thus were no longer productive. According to the racial logics of the era then, these waste places were perfectly suited for Black people who were also regarded as the waste and refuse of plantation modernity. When John F.B. Marshall, who loaned Washington the funds to purchase 100 acres of the Bowen plantation, when he inquired about the quality of the land, Washington replied thusly: "We now have the farm under control. About 25 acres are cleared, the other under wood. This, I think, is an advantage. I think the cleared land is in a better condition than the farm there was, though it is more hilly. This is a hilly country and it is hard to find a level place in a tract." And so when Washington says that the newly cleared land is in better condition than the previous one, he's referring to that eroded cotton plantation that he initially purchased, right? But it also acknowledges that it's hilly country and will be difficult to cultivate crops there. Indeed, the land was so rough and infertile that George Washington Carver, apparently on seeing the campus for the first time, insinuated that it was fit to support only the school's roaming herd of razorback hogs that looked as though they were built for speed rather than for the table. And yet, Washington consistently noted in his communications with Marshall that, quote, "the land is deeded to the trustees not to be held as state property. Hence, the state has no control over the land." In other words, even eroded hilly land was worth the possibility of autonomy as he sought to implant Black life, Black futures into the blood-soaked soils of the post-Reconstruction US South. By the early 1900s, Washington could proudly tout that instead of the old worn-out plantation that was there 15 years ago, there is a modern farm of 700 acres cultivated by student labor. The campus was so impressive that visitors would often refer to it as Booker T. Washington City. In Up From Slavery, he visualizes this transition by juxtaposing images of the slave cabins that once littered the plantation with images of the updated Tuskegee campus on the bottom right, with its modern buildings funded by the titans of American industrialism. I want to linger with this transition from old worn-out plantation to modern farm, both rhetorically and materially. Above, I have argued that Washington uses this logic to establish Tuskegee as a site for the production of modern Black subjectivity, from the old Negro slavery to a Southern New Negro aesthetic that attempts to reconcile bourgeois Victorian values with agricultural and industrial labor. Here, I wish to consider the material, terrestrial, and broader ecological arms of Washington's and Tuskegee's aesthetic cum ontological project. For Washington, the plantation turned modern farm could indeed be otherwise productive of Black futures. In his recruitment letter to George Washington Carver, Washington writes, quote, "Our students are poor, often starving. They travel miles of torn roads across years of poverty. We teach them to read and write, but words cannot fill stomachs. They need to learn how to plant and harvest crops." As a Tuskegee faculty member, he maintains, Carver would be faced with the challenge of bringing people from degradation, poverty, and waste to full manhood, end quote. Lingering at the intersection of Washington and Carver's work, I propose Black eco-ontologies as a concept for grappling with how planting and harvesting crops was, at Tuskegee, inextricably intertwined with racial uplift and the journey from degradation, poverty, and waste to full manhood. If, as I argue above, Washington sought to reconstruct the image or sign of the Negro by touting the dignity and aesthetics of labor, then Carver's efforts to regenerate the land suggest that there was indeed a terrestrial and ecological component of the Tuskegee project as well. In place of the burned big house, Washington and his faculty and students erected a campus whose landscape and architecture countered the extractive logics of the plantation. Despite being built on poor land, Grandison notes, Tuskegee's roadways and adjacent buildings turned this way and that in intimate response to the natural folds of the land. The overall layout of the early campus was remarkable for the manner in which it intimately fitted site. Thus, the building of Tuskegee's campus may be as close as we can come to a 19th century model, and I'm quoting Grandison here, of what might be called socially sustainable development. That is, the integration of physical development with community autonomy and empowerment, and the ability of the system to form the basis of positive cycles of improvement to both institution and community. Alongside Grandison's claims for Tuskegee's built environment, I want to turn to Carver's work as an early model of Black ecological sustainability and social responsibility, or what Monica White calls collective agency and community resilience. Indeed, in her recent book, Freedom Farmers, White argues that Washington, Carver, and Du Bois laid the groundwork for contemporary Black farming and food justice initiatives. And Up From Slavery, Washington lamented the problem of monocropping among poor Black farmers in Alabama's plantation districts. Despite the fact that the land all about the cabins' homes could easily have been made to produce nearly every kind of garden vegetable that is raised anywhere in the country, he complains, their one object seemed to be to plant nothing but cotton. And in many cases, cotton was planted up to the very door of the cabin. Washington is concerned here with how monocropping continued to put a stranglehold on rural Black domestic life and slavery. On rural Black domestic life after slavery. Instead of growing cotton and their own vegetables for consumption, formerly enslaved peoples purchased food from the local commissary, locking themselves into a perennial cycle of debt and economic dependence on the very plantation commodity that exploited their labor and the land around them. At Tuskegee, however, where students also practice cotton cultivation, 135 acres of the main campus and 350 acres of the Marshall Farm were used to produce the vast amount of farm and garden products consumed by the institution. Upon purchasing the property, Washington acknowledged that our land is not regular cotton land, though it will grow cotton. But I'm satisfied that that will not be the most profitable thing to cultivate. The regular cotton land is low and swampy. Our land will produce all the common vegetables and especially sweet potatoes. Such things will pay us well. We can sell what we do not consume. So this was the model of subsistence farming, semi-large-scale subsistence farming that Tuskegee sought to encourage among rural Black folk in the plantation districts, right? Growing food for their own consumption first, and then growing cotton and other vegetables for sale on the market. This represents the plot plantation or provision ground plantation paradigm that Sylvia Winter theorizes in her work on the plantation as a critical geography for Black identity formation in the so-called New World. What would it mean then to suggest that Tuskegee was possessed of a plot logic, right? If you sit with this comment that Washington says, he says that he's okay with the fact that cotton won't be the most profitable thing to cultivate, right? So what would it mean to suggest that the Bowen plantation, this originary site of degraded Black ontology, or more precisely that degraded Black ontology, right, could be otherwise productive? This is not to overlook the very real limitations of Booker T. Washington's political project and how it was used to restrain certain forms of Black progress. However, the plot was never completely separate from the plantation anyway, even as it consistently strained against it. In fact, many plots were located on plantations adjacent to the sugar, cotton, tobacco, and rice fields that attempted to reduce the Black body to its labor power. Thus, I read Tuskegee for these moments, practices, and logics of straining against extraction and depletion, and redirect our attention toward regenerating, sustaining, and advancing Black life. In institutional literature, Washington demonstrates how through Carver's ingenuity as agricultural director, Tuskegee tackled the problem of monocropping. Through diagrams and a summary of Carver's research findings, Washington explains the importance of the school's success with crop rotation as a mode of improving and regenerating the soil, and outlines best practices for small farmers. For instance, on a 40-acre farm, they recommend growing cotton alongside numerous other vegetables and foodstuff. Right, this diagram that you see before you illustrates the amount of each crop that should be planted, where the crop should be located on the plot, and which crops should replace it the following year to replenish and to build up the soils. In his own writings, Carver articulated an explicit connection between uplifting Southern farmers and ecological regeneration. He insisted on the mutual relationship of the animal, mineral, and vegetable kingdoms, and how utterly impossible it is for one to exist in a highly organized state without the other. Furthermore, he made explicit the connection between the Plantationocene's degradation of the land and the challenges of Southern farm life, right? Noting that the virgin fertility of our Southern soils and the vast amount of cheap and unskilled labor that has been put on them have been a curse rather than a blessing to agriculture. This exhaustive system of cultivation, The destruction of forests, the rapid and almost constant decomposition of organic matter, and the great number of noxious insects and fungi that appear every year make our agricultural problem one requiring more brains than that of the North, East, and West. To this end, Carver experimented with environmentally friendly fertilizers to restore the fertility of the nutrient-depleted soils of the South. Realizing that most small farmers could not afford commercial fertilizers, he proposed manure in its broadest sense, consisting of decayed leaves, dead animals, decayed night soil, animal manures that have washed from hillsides, and other natural resources that farmers could easily find around them. These deposits have been accumulating for years, he writes, and are recognized as the acme of manures and that which will build up a soil permanently, right? He continues that we know that commercial fertilizer will stimulate and for a while produce good results in the way of vegetation, but by and by a collapse will come as the soil will be reduced to practically clay and sand. The above does not mean that we are to use no commercial fertilizer, but supplement our home manures with them, which will not only give us as good results, but permanently improve our soil. Right? So Carver's insistence on using animal and plant waste to regenerate waste places is a powerful metaphor for how Black people, deemed the waste and refuse of modernity, attempted to regenerate themselves by regenerating the land around them. Carver's commitment to ecologically sustainable agriculture also included a sense of social responsibility or an ethics of care, wherein he translated and disseminated his scientific knowledge to local farmers. He published countless articles and tracts on how to make farm life more productive and sustainable. And here are a few images, or it's an image of one of those earlier tracts. So when we read Tuskegee's visual archive depicting the Southern New Negro alongside Carver's bulletins, my notion of Black eco-ontology comes into clearer focus. After all, the students depicted in the photographs attempting to reconcile farm life with bourgeois Victorian sartorial aesthetics were also assisting Carver in his various scientific agriculture experiments on the school's farm in the fields. In his bulletins, Carver encouraged improved plowing, watering, and fertilization methods. They included photographs, charts, graphs, and hand-drawn diagrams, often drawn by Carver himself. They meticulously documented cultivation practices and the results of the school's agricultural experiments. In an 1899 bulletin entitled Fertilizer Experiments on Cotton, for instance, Carver included photographs that would demonstrate the crop yields of various fertilizers. Right, and this was not necessarily the before and after format that Washington used to demonstrate the effects of student training, but was guided by a similar logic of regeneration and productivity, and I argue should be included as a part of thinking about Tuskegee's visual archive. Right, in 1897, Carver designated a section of the Marshall Farm for agricultural experiments. The soil selected is excellently adapted for experimental purposes, he writes, having formed part of an old field which has been planted by the wasteful methods of the tenant system, year after year for a long period. If for Washington, tenant farming kept Black Southerners subjected to the labor and economic exploitation of the post-slavery plantation system, then for Carver, it also continued the vicious cycle of soil exhaustion. He writes, the soil was so thoroughly worn out as to its supply of fertilizing substances, nitrogen, potash, and phosphoric acid, and was also in very bad physical condition. Its humus had long since been totally worked out, and the topsoil was very thin and with very little power to retain moisture. Even cowpeas, which I take were very simple to cultivate, failed to make a fair growth on this soil before these experiments were begun, which is a pretty sure sign of a soil practically exhausted. In a 1905 bulletin entitled How to Build Up Worn Out Soils, he details how over an 8-year period, he conducted a range of agricultural experiments to test improving the soil, keeping in mind the poor tenant farmer with a one-horse equipment, so that every operation performed has been within his reach, right? The station having only one horse. So Carver routinely selected the poorest quality land for his experiments. And I want to emphasize that, right? That he started with the least of these, right? The poorest soil, right? So just as Tuskegee's visual archive sought to capture students meticulously training in industrial machinery and trades, Carver details the slow process of regenerating this plot of land from degradation to productiveness. And so as I prepare to close, bear with me as I kind of walk us through the ways in which he sort of details the regeneration of the land, right? The soil, and this is Carver, was practically sand and clay, and owing to its altitude, this hillside was badly washed. The whole 10 acres was full of large stumps. Considering the physical condition first in importance, we therefore began to fill the ditches with pine tops, hay, bark, old cotton stalks, leaves, in fact, rubbish of any kind that would decay and ultimately make soil. As an occasional load of earth was thrown in upon it to give it more weight and firmness. And so as I'm walking us through this, I want you to be thinking about regeneration, right? What does regeneration look like, and how the regeneration of the land is thinking about those images of Tuskegee students as well, right? I'll actually put it on the screen working, right? This is the process, we're visualizing it. He goes on to delineate the multi-year process of bringing this rundown land back to life, increasing the water holding power of the soil, adding about 1 acre to the actual amount of land upon which crops are grown, and ultimately bringing to the surface much latent fertility that had sunken below the depth to which the roots could penetrate by reason of the hard soil lying so near the surface. By 1902, Carver observed that the soil began to look dark and rich and mellow, right, due to the gradual deepening of the soil, right? And by 1905, he would conclude that even the poorest sandy soils can be economically made to produce a full 500-pound bale of lint to the acre, and referring to cotton. In short, regenerating worn-out soils was consistent with regenerating Black ontology. Importantly, Carver insisted on the chief aim of this experiment was to keep every operation within reach of the poorest tenant farmer, right, occupying the poorest possible soil, right? And so he typically wrote his bulletins in non-technical language, right, and tried to ensure that every farmer could master the problems of when, with what, and how shall I fertilize my crops in such a manner so as to produce the maximum yield and do it with the least financial expense and the least injury to the soil. And this way, Carver contributed to a Black agrarian future, right, that was both ethical, autonomous, and ecologically sustainable. Though still beholden to a logic of productivity that undergirded the plantation as a technology of extraction, like the distinction between discipline and training that I called our attention to earlier, Carver's desire to produce the maximum yield for poor farmers and to do it with the least financial expense and the least injury to the soil is indeed a counter plantation logic. He is not solely motivated by market imperatives or the avarice of global capitalist accumulation. In fact, many of the bulletins teach farmers how to grow foodstuff, not just cotton, to feed their families with the aim of becoming more economically independent. Carver also participated in Tuskegee's annual Negro Farmers Conference, arguably the first and oldest conference of its kind, wherein Tuskegee brought local farmers together to share best practices and teach the newest trends in agricultural science. And that conference is actually still operating to this very day. But still, given that cotton still reigned supreme within the Southern economy at this time, Carver also experimented with different cotton varieties to ascertain which ones grew best in the region's soils. And so he set out, in a 1915 bulletin printed by Tuskegee students, he announced that he had discovered a new and prolific variety of cotton through crossbreeding several existing cotton varieties. And he had evidence from local cotton factors that it would significantly, that the new variety of cotton that he developed would significantly increase the yield, right? So with an average crop year, this would mean for Alabama nearly $1.5 million, and for Macon County alone, over $39,000, right? And so throughout that bulletin, he continues to instruct farmers on how to cultivate this crop for maximum profit, from the preparation of the soil to fertilization to cultivation and to picking, right? So in closing, I want to consider this new variety of cotton as a metaphor for the aims of the Tuskegee New Negro Project more broadly, and Black eco-ontology in particular. Through scientific agriculture, Carver regenerated Tuskegee's eroded and worn out soils and produced a new variety of cotton that would make farming an economically viable occupation for Black Southerners. Though farming and cotton cultivation in particular were practically synonymous with plantation slavery, they persisted as modes of Black economic autonomy well into the 20th century. Indeed, Carver viewed Black health and soil health as inextricably intertwined, noting that wherever the soil is wasted, the people are wasted. A poor soil produces only a poor people, poor economically, poor spiritually and intellectually, poor physically. Similarly, through photography, Booker T. Washington sought to reinvest the laboring Black body, Black skin, Black flesh with new indexical possibilities. Through sartorial self-fashioning and depicting students in chemical laboratories and engaging industrial machinery, their ontological distance, he evinced Black people's capacity to perform the higher forms of labor, and more importantly, their ontological distance from the degraded category or status of the slave. So while Tuskegee is often dismissed and rightly criticized for facilitating Black political accommodationism, I propose it as a potential site for interrogating a more ethical and sustainable relationship between race and ecology, Black life and plant life within Black studies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jarvis. Thank you. That was really wonderful, incredibly rich, dense, and I'm sure a lot of questions will start coming in. Just as a reminder to our audience, there is the Q&A. Oh, sorry, no, it's the chat. If you can actually, no, it's the Q&A. I'm sorry. Where is the Q&A gone? In the chat, I suppose. Sarah, I actually don't see the Q&A here.
You don't see it at the bottom of your screen?
There it is. It's arrived. Sorry about that. It was eluding me. I'm sorry about that. Okay.
No worries. Jarvis, if you could stop sharing your screen. Sometimes the screen share makes other elements harder to see.
I was trying to figure out how to do that. Thank you.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you. Thanks. Okay, so Jarvis, there are in fact many questions already coming in. I want to start with a question from Tsitsi Jiaji, our colleague in the English department. And she says, Washington commensurates the value of work in the field and poetry. I'm intrigued, even delighted, by his choice of poetry as the paradigmatic genre of writing in the prestigious arts. And she'd like you to talk more about the place of poetry in your project. And as an aside, the insistence on training rather than discipline as the terms of their project also interests me. I associate training with the arts. One trains in performance, painting, etc. Whereas the university segregates its disciplines, she says.
That's a wonderfully rich question, Tsitsi. I really appreciate it. I think that one place where I interrogate poetry is in the work of Claude McKay. I do write about McKay as someone who actually attended. So in the larger book project, I'm looking at not only Tuskegee, but also the Black diasporic intellectuals who moved to and through Tuskegee, oftentimes adapting and jettisoning Tuskegee's logics. And McKay actually traveled from Jamaica in 1912 to attend Tuskegee to study agriculture there in that year. And when he got there, he was already a kind of burgeoning poet, a folk poet who wrote in sort of Jamaican vernacular and patois English at that time. And he wanted to be an agricultural educator. And then he got to Tuskegee and actually felt that Tuskegee was too militaristic, right? And so he left Tuskegee, but actually then returns to the significance of Washington and Tuskegee later in his thought. And so I engage poetry most explicitly through my work with McKay in the project. And I think that's probably the most explicit, that's probably the place where I engage it most explicitly, really thinking about, the language of his dialect poetry in Jamaica and the ways that it allows me to, that he's also thinking with agricultural commodities such as bananas, and is actually in many ways extolling peasant cultivation methods, as opposed to, ironically, paradoxically, or maybe it's actually quite fitting given that McKay jettisons and rejects Washington and Tuskegee, opposed to scientific agricultural methods. At the same time, though, he often referred to George Washington Carver as his dear instructor. So he loved Carver, was critical of scientific agriculture, and lauded, peasant cultivation methods, right, as well. So I think that that's a very rich place for I'm thinking about the way that I suppose a poet is helps us to think at the intersection of Black life and plant life, and the plantation in the project. And to your second question, Tsitsi, about, oh goodness, I've forgotten it now. Let's see.
You can take a look in the Q&A if you like, or I can just remind you. Yeah.
I see it now. I actually want to just thank you for that. I think that's a wonderful, I'll take that as a kind of deepening of my effort to disaggregate discipline and training. Yeah, I think that there is quite a bit of training happening at Tuskegee. And my approach to it is actually through aesthetics, right? So it's through photography, but also through music. There's another part of this chapter that focuses on the teaching of the Negro spirituals at Tuskegee, and the fact that Washington often referred to them as plantation melodies, and the ways that he attempts to repurpose the kind of music of the plantation to advance Black progress and futurity in the same way that the Fish Jubilee singers do, right? And the way that the Tuskegee Institute singers are often resisting, if the students in these images are kind of resisting being viewed or resisting being collapsed with images of enslavement, right? The Tuskegee Institute singers are actually resisting being read as minstrels, right? Because they understand themselves to be engaged in producing a kind of new Negro sound for the new century, right? And so that's where I further think about training. So I appreciate that.
Thank you. Thanks, Jarvis. So there's questions from Marcy and Bill Ferris, who commend you on your talk, and say, so glad you noted the annual Farmers Conference at Tuskegee, which is taking place as you speak today, virtually, and that's the 129th. And the question is asking whether there are parallels between Tuskegee and Tougaloo.
Yes, no, that's a wonderful question. Absolutely. I started thinking about what it meant to establish a future-oriented project on a former cotton plantation when I was a student at Tougaloo College, which is also a former cotton plantation where, in fact, unlike Tuskegee, the big house or the mansion house has not been burned. It is actually still a kind of a central feature of campus, and it has been, but after slavery, the founders of the school have used that site, that mansion house, for all kinds of different purposes. It's been used as a dorm, it's been used as an administration building, it's been used as a classroom. And I like to think about, although that mansion house is still present, there's some allure around the mansion house that the owner of that mansion house, Bodie, he was the owner of the Bodie plantation, actually built the home for his fiancée. But when she learned how cruel he was to the people that he owned, to his slaves, she actually refused to marry him. And so I like to think about the fact that mansion house would never enable the kind of consummation of sort of that union and the kind of persistence of plantation governmentality that it would have enabled.
Thanks, Jarvis. So there's a question from Kathleen Burns, who's a student here at Duke. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. Can you say a bit more about how you see processes and technologies of visualization and the visual archive of Tuskegee, working alongside your emphasis on the underground material archive of the soil and or the Plantationocene? In other words, how does imagining a Black agrarian future seem to depend on bringing these two together? Does it bring out the speculative and imaginative elements of the material archive?
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm gonna. That's such a rich question, Kathleen. Thank you so much. And I'm gonna focus on the speculative for just a moment, by sort of using a term that I use throughout the talk in a couple of places, which is performance and artifice, right? So there's a way that they are performing new Negro subjectivity, right? They are performing these images are not necessarily the sort of truthful or factual, right? It's by dressing up in their very best, right, that they are able, that they are speculating about a Black future that they want to, right, that they are projecting will happen through this training, right? And so I definitely use sort of speculation as a kind of reading praxis and methodology as a way to kind of, you know, emphasize or to highlight the ways in which what they're doing is highly artificial, is highly performative, and inherently sort of future oriented, right, as well. Because like right around the campus, right, is when you step off campus, you're in the heart of the Jim Crow South, right, in the early part of the 20th century, right, the nadir, right, of African-American life and history, right? And so even though they're depicting this as a space of Black vitality, yes, on the campus that was the case, but there were often sort of contentious relationships between the campus and life outside of the campus, right? And so there is something highly speculative, highly performative, artificial about what Washington was doing there.
Thank you. Thanks. I want to bring together two questions now, one from Charlotte Sussman and one from Ava Levon Vincent, maybe. And both are asking about this idea of the regeneration that comes out, the regeneration of life in the ruins, as it were. And Charlotte Sussman, our colleague in the English department, asks if you have thoughts about the relationship between the afterlife of the plantation that you discuss and the traces of what preceded the cotton plantation, indigenous communities. She says, I'm thinking that that trace persists in the name Tuskegee, ? But I could be wrong about the origin of the name. And Ava Levon Vincent asks about whether you've come across any suggestion of a spiritual infusion to assist in the regeneration of the soil. Were there any obvious spiritual processes in place to make waste spaces full of life?
Wonderful, both really, really terrific questions. Thank you. So first, yes, I believe that Tuskegee is a Native American term in the same way that Tougaloo is, actually, my own alma mater. They're both Native American terms. I don't know about the relationship between, say, if in, you know, sort of regenerating those plantation lands, they actually found material objects, say arrowheads or things like that, right, or pottery from Native America, right? So a very, like, you know, material connection to those spaces. I'm not sure about that. I've not seen any evidence to suggest that. What I will say is that the Tuskegee Project did attempt to also civilize. It was a civilizing and subject making institution and project, and so there was an effort to civilize Native Americans and to sort of bring that bring that population in line with a broader civilizational project. And that's what is so tricky about the Tuskegee Project, is that, you know, it really is contextual, right? When we think about what is liberating and, or, you know, if one wants to use the term resistance or even radical, right, about it, really is historically contingent and contextual, right? In the same way that Washington, right, is making an argument for regenerating Black ontology, there are, you know, colonial officials in Africa or in the Caribbean who want to take up that project to actually, and in the U.S. actually, right, to limit Black futures as well, right? And so that back to your point about Native Americans, I would say that Washington did work with Native American communities, both at Hampton and at Tuskegee. And the way that gets taken up feels more civilizational. I feel like it's still attached to that particular thread, that particular line from the colonial plantations of Hawaii that Samuel Armstrong actually began to, where he derived his own notion of colonial education, right? It feels like it's still attached to that, right? So it is, again, it's necessarily fraught, which is why I asked, can it be burned away, right? Can those logics be burned away? And to the second point about spirituality, I'm not sure. I've not come across it. I think about spirituality and the plantation in my own teaching and research. I teach a class on conjure and sort of African-derived religious and spiritual and healing practices in the New World. It would be my speculation. I've never seen any evidence in the archive to suggest that was a part of what they were doing at Tuskegee. They really were invested in sort of agricultural science, right? And it would be my speculation also that at this time, because Africa was generally considered by most sort of Black American and New World and Black people in the Americas as a kind of savage, you know, as a savage space, that they were not at a point yet, where they could honor and recognize the utility of those sort of spiritual practices, right, as a kind to resist or to undo or to open up or to, you know, to participate in the regeneration of the land that they were engaged in. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. There's a question from Nia Bates, who asks if you would draw out the more gendered aspects of your concept of eco-ontology. And Nia is interested in whether women were trained to sketch and draw plants, for example, aside from the manual labor of cultivating a garden, were women trained in related areas of canning, dealing with domestic livestock, etc. And for subsistence farming purposes, what roles were assigned to women versus men for sustaining the home?
Right. I mean, from what I've seen of Tuskegee's curriculum in this time, in terms of sustaining domestic life, those women were taught to engage in horticulture and floriculture primarily. I don't have any photographic evidence or even any sort of archival evidence to suggest that they were engaged in sort of animal husbandry or anything like that. I believe that those industries were reserved for male students, but that is actually something that I can check on and get back to you, Nia, if you're interested. It's simple checking of my archive to see. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from the historian Mab Segrist, who says, thanks so much for such a rich investigation of Tuskegee. I mean, I should say to you, because I can scan the questions in ways that you can't, there's a lot of praise for your talk, Jarvis, a lot of interest and thanks from the audience. So thanks so much for a rich investigation of Tuskegee under Washington and Carver. This ecology extends to Black rural resistance, for example, in the sharecroppers uprising in the 1930s, Robin Kelly's Hammer and the Hoe, in nearby Notasulga, or the priority of SNCC workers for rural voter registration in the 1960s electoral uprisings, given Macon County's vast majority of Black people in the county. And I think that the question is here, do these swatches point to a larger domestic Black aesthetic beyond the bourgeois, right? So there's a question here about some that are on display in the Carver Museum on Tuskegee, on the campus.
Sure. Well, I'll just say I think that what's happening in the material that I presented today actually sets the stage for what is to come in the 30s and in the 60s, when Tuskegee actually at some point Tuskegee shifts from being considered an old worn out plantation to really becoming a site that is cultivating a Black middle class, right? And I think that we see that explicitly sort of imagined, right, and speculated about in those images in the late 19th and early 20th century, but it actually comes to fruition by the time we get to the 60s, right? And so I think that what we see in the period that I am working on, again, is a kind of imagining of what, and so Tuskegee no longer is, a site that is at some point, it's no longer educating sort of, former enslaved people. They're largely educating, children of parents who also have, who have also been highly educated, right? And so that meaning begins to shift, and I think that it helps to enable the fact that Macon County in that particular region becomes a real sort of crucible of Black middle class in some ways, uplift, and Black working class uplift, as you referred to sort of Snake and Robin Kelly's work and so forth and so on. So I think that is it is a kind of prefiguration, right, of what happens. And oh my gosh, I think I've forgotten the second part of the question, which was, sorry.
Which was not, she says, in terms of Carver's domestic aesthetic for rural Black people in Macon County on display in the Carver Museum on the Tuskegee campus are a set of stunningly beautiful paint swatches that he created from the minerals in the county's soil, thinking that such colored paint would provide an affordable way for poor rural people to beautify their homes.
Yeah.
Do these swatches point to a larger domestic Black aesthetic beyond the bourgeois?
Yeah. That's helpful. I really like that, and I'll actually take that as a point to consider. I think that Washington was very much invested in a Black bourgeois project. I don't know that Carver shared that commitment in this way. Yeah.
So there's a question from Alex Nickley. Could you discuss how some of the other land grant institutions in the South were approaching the problem of soil degradation and unsustainable agriculture at the turn of the century? Yeah.
I'm not 100% sure about that. I've not studied it beyond Tuskegee. What I can say is that a number of those schools actually did deploy Tuskegee methods. That was part of, as I talked about toward the end of the talk, the Tuskegee Negro Farmers Conferences. There was a movable school. There were many efforts to disseminate. Right. There was Tuskegee had its own printing press, and there's a wide body of literature that intended to disseminate Carver's findings at Tuskegee so that other educational institutions could deploy them. Tuskegee also trained a number of teachers, as well as it was largely known as a teacher training school at this time. And so those students would go in the same way that McKay sought to, they would go to rural communities and establish schools based on the Tuskegee method. So I would conjecture that is how other Black land grant institutions were able to do that work. It's in part through Tuskegee's massive sort of dissemination machine.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So there's a question from Henry Washington, and I think this is a kind of question that often comes up in the fields that you occupy, and also the fields of post-colonial studies that we share in some ways, and that question is can the originary violence of the plantation really ever be sufficiently burned away? And he says, I think your project is productive for cultivating a rich method for speculation on the question. And I'm curious to hear more about whether you are convinced that the actual yield bears out its promise, whether that is important. This is also perhaps a question about whether the practice of laboring and its redefinition in this context, the point of this economic aesthetic project might actually be something that is really generative ultimately. How might Washington and Carver have felt about the stubbornness of the land to produce a yield?
Right. No, thank you, Henry, for that really generative and important question. And I think the way that I'll answer it is by thinking about, again, a question that often comes up for us is the difference between success and failure, right? And Robin Kelley writes about this in Freedom Dreams, that so many of those projects of freedom dreaming, right, of Black freedom dream projects were failures. But if we were to, only write about the projects that succeeded, then we wouldn't have anything to write about, right? Because to this very day we are still resisting and protesting and trying to deconstruct and dismantle many of those white supremacist logics that were put in place at the dawn of modernity, right? And so I think that there is always a productive tension there. That I like to sort of dwell in and to hold in place, and to acknowledge those moments, that practice of straining against, right, and those moments of what we might call success, maybe, right? Those moments of attempting to do something different, of attempting to imagine otherwise. I do think that they were somewhat successful in some ways, and in some ways they can't do the work of upending a system that is as all-consuming, right? And that's as protean as global capitalist white supremacy. Right, like it can't do that, but I'm interested in the straining, in the process, right, of doing it. And I'm also interested in the ways in which it reinforces, right, and trying to, right, in those images, are readers of those periodical publications that see Black students laboring, do they see them as an extension of slavery, or are they paying attention to the sartorial self-fashioning that's happening as a way to help them, as a way of sort of laying claim to their new Negro identity, right? Mm-hmm. So I guess a short answer to that is we have to exist in the straining, right, and take up a space in the straining, in the attempt. Yeah.
So Jarvis, we are actually out of time. I'm wondering if I might, however, just impose on you for a question from the chair, as it were. We will get the other questions to you that we haven't actually managed to address. And I'm sorry, everyone, if we couldn't address your question. I have a question about time and ontology, because one of the things that's very striking to me in your talk is the question of time, right? Is a time that is the gradual time of the land, the rotational time, the slow fertilization, the life cycles of the crop year, and in a sense also photography and the question of time and the indexical in photography. So I'm wondering if whether this sort of eco-ontology that you're developing here, whether you imagine whether the in a sense, on an ontological level, temporality is just the process of change, right? On one hand, but also, on another level, there's the idea that concrete beings, right, beings who are maybe generated from the land, are not merely in time, as it were, but they are temporal beings. So I'm just wondering if you could sort of say a little bit about how the time of these spaces shapes the ontology?
That's a great question. That's a great question. How the time of these spaces shapes the ontology. I mean, I think that, you know, it's a slow time, and you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to kind of point back to those, you know, to that moment in the Carver, where Carver, you know, takes sort of like 7 years, right, to talk about the regeneration of this land, right? And there's a way that, you know, and this is really what the Tuskegee Project was accused for. And this is, you know, Washington was always accused of, forcing or encouraging Black people that now is not the time. I'm actually going to cite my friend and colleague Julius Fleming, his theory of Black patience, right? Insisting in his forthcoming book on Black patience, and, you know, insisting that, you know, now is not the time for political advancement right here, right? Now is the time for economic advancement, and then we'll get to that sort of political advancement later on. And so I do think that that is a justifiable sort of critique of that particular project. And I guess I kind of wonder if the photograph is a way of those photographs of students working in the effort to sort of bring together bourgeois values with the kind of goals and commitments of farming is a way to kind of speed up that time, but photographically, right? So I think that there are ways that different media, as you pointed to, actually articulate and represent time differently, right? And so again, because that medium is speculative and is sort of future oriented, how does it attempt to sort of speed up, you know, that project of sort of Black progress and advancement that's actually not quite happening at that moment, or it's happening at a much slower pace. But if I dress you up, right, in sort of fancy clothes and hats and so forth and so on, I show that you're not dirty, and that you can, you know, you have on the accoutrements of bourgeois Victorian sartorial stylings. How is that sort of a kind of speeding up that even the soil regeneration can't do? Or we might even think about it in terms of music, right? If we think about the Negro spirituals, right? And the way that the Tuskegee Institute singers insisted on not being confused with minstrels, right? And as a way of, you know, they wanted to demonstrate that that by sort of rearranging these tunes, right, into European style harmonies, right? I'm sure that must have impacted the rhythm and sort of the tempo of the songs as well, right? And how is that a kind of speeding up to latch on to this kind of new Negro subjectivity that they are working to attain, but actually the political and socioeconomic conditions actually haven't bared out yet. Does that make sense?
Right. Yes, absolutely. No, that's a great response. Thank you. Well, we have gone over time, and I want to thank you, Jarvis, for a really wonderful presentation and an animated question time as well. And I want to thank our audience for coming. As I said, I apologize if we didn't get to your question, but we will get those questions to Jarvis. And I hope to see people next week for our next TGI FHI. But in the meantime, really, thank you so much, Jarvis. This is wonderful.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been wonderful and generative.
Good. Okay. Take care.
Bye.